Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. This week we're talking about Chapter 9 in our textbook. It's week 10 of class, so welcome. Not going to spend a lot of time on the content of the chapter, but the major sections of this chapter are the post-war Soviet Union, ferment in Eastern Europe, culture and society in the Soviet bloc, and the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. So we've been talking about the Cold War. Last week we talked about the Cold War, and what was happening during the Cold War on the other side of the world, over in the Soviet Union, over in Europe, is what this chapter is about. And before we get started, I think the big relevance here, obviously, is the war in Ukraine. Why is Ukraine an independent country right now? Well, Ukraine became Ukraine an independent country when the Cold War ended, 1989 through 1991. So Ukraine became this independent country. It developed a very democratic system since the 1990s until the current day, whereas Putin in Russia has maintained this idea of communist command and control of the media, control of the people, rigged elections, all of the above. So this chapter tells us the story of the Soviet Union after World War II and how we got to today and why Putin is being aggressive in Ukraine, because he's starting to reassemble or try to reassemble the Soviet Union again. One of the biggest, most valuable territories of the USSR was Ukraine, not only because of its agricultural advantages, but also it's where a lot of the nuclear missiles were back in the day. It's where a lot of the nuclear power came, and it's really the most Western European country of the old Soviet bloc, so it's really important to Putin. And I think when you read this chapter, you start to understand why that is. So with that in mind, there are four major sections in the chapter. The first one is the post-war Soviet Union, and that really talks about sort of what's going on there as far as the economy is concerned, who's in charge. So Stalin dies in this period. Khrushchev actually came out after Stalin died and denounced Stalin and some of his more evil tactics, which was shocking. Khrushchev was eventually removed from office after the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's a quiz question, so make sure you know it. Brezhnev was put in power, but still the media was state-run. There were ongoing economic problems, and so one of the questions in the quiz, besides the Khrushchev-Cuban Missile Crisis question that I just gave you, was a question about the Soviet economy. There's a question in the quiz that talks about a sentence in the chapter that has to do with Russian defense and the Russian space program. And when you read that question, the answer is that it's economic in nature. It's not a great question, but the point is that in this section of the book, it talks about the fact that the USSR spent so much money on defense and the space program that their consumer economy never really took off. The consumers and citizens of the USSR and moving into modern Russia are very oppressed as far as consumerism and products are concerned. So that's why the Russian economy, or the Soviet Union's economy right after World War II, was totally dominated by defense spending, and spending on the space program. So just keep that in mind, and that's sort of the big characteristic of post-war Soviet Union, spending all of their money on defense. And the second section is the chapter about other stuff going on in Eastern Europe. If you remember, all right, the Eastern Bloc, all of these countries in Eastern Europe are taken over by the USSR following World War II, and these communist governments are installed everywhere. And there were uprisings in Hungary, there were uprisings in Poland, in Romania, Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring. You'll read about all this stuff. And so the point here is that during the Cold War in Eastern Europe, there was a lot of stuff going on, and it took the Russians a tight rein on these other countries to make sure nothing got out of control. And one of the reasons that the U.S. sort of stood idly by, especially during uprisings in Poland and Hungary in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, really, is because the U.S. didn't want to start World War III. That's a quiz question, so make sure you know that when there's a question about why didn't the U.S. take action in Hungary, why didn't it go into Budapest? the reason is that the U.S. was sensitive to starting another nuclear war. So read about that in section 2. And there's a section about culture and society in the Soviet bloc. It's very brief. Okay. The reason it's brief is there's no free expression in China or in Russia. There wasn't then, there isn't now. The state controls all of the media. The state controls everything else. I mean, if you publish something and it's not cool with the Communist Party, you're going to get hauled off to the gulag real quick. So there's not a lot of culture to talk about. The 4th section of the chapter talks about the fall of the Soviet Empire. So it talks about Gorbachev taking over in 1985 after Chernenko dies. And Gorbachev was a smart reformer. And really, his reforms include, private property. So you could buy stuff. And the oligarchs that you've heard about are really kind of created in this era because a lot of the old state-owned enterprises are sold off to basically rich guys who become richer. Those are the oligarchs who are still in power today with Putin. But that happens under Gorbachev in the 1980s. And finally, the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. I remember it well. It was awesome. And basically, the reason that the USSR disintegrated was all about money. Money and power. They really didn't have the financial strength to fund these armies, to keep a tight rein on all of these governments. And there was just too much stuff going on in these Eastern European countries. There would have been so many uprisings that the USSR would have disintegrated eventually anyway. But it happened in 1989 under Reagan's watch. And in 91, the USSR officially ceases to exist. It's the Federation, Russian Federation, and Yeltsin is put in charge in 1999, takes over after Gorbachev resigns, and Yeltsin enacts these reforms to a free market economy, but he does it too quickly, and there are major problems in the economy. And citizens aren't really happy about it. There's big questions about these reforms, and does capitalism work? And basically, Putin comes in, seizes power, really kind of reinforces the power of the command and control structure of the leadership, really becomes a dictator, and you know the rest of the story. Putin is the aggressor in Ukraine today, and I want you to think about Ukraine the whole time you're reading this chapter, because this is the perfect precursor. You could have predicted what was going to happen had you read this chapter ahead of time and thought about the personality of Vladimir Putin over there. So read it on your own. It's an interesting chapter, and I'm really curious what's going to happen, because the latest thing I talked about when I wrote these notes a few years ago was Putin taking over Crimea, which was the first part of the Ukraine invasion many years ago. So now we're right back at it again. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. With that in mind, let me look at the quiz real quick and make sure we covered that in detail. We talked a little bit about the Russian economy, and there's a section in the book that talks about the development of thermonuclear weapons and MiG fighter jets and the space program in Russia. And when you read about this section, the answer is it deals with, or it is related to, the USSR's economy and fiscal priorities. So again, just to be clear, the USSR's economic and fiscal priorities in the post-war period, it was all about developing defense and the space program. So keep that in mind. One of the reasons that Khrushchev was voted out of power was because of his mishandling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We touched on that once or twice in the past 2 weeks. Why didn't the U.S. assist Hungary or Poland during the uprisings in the 50s and the 60s? I just covered that. It was for fear of starting a nuclear war. We talked about the economy of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation today. It depends mostly on oil revenue. Remember, their economy is smaller than that of Texas, smaller than California, and smaller than New York. Russia spends all of their money on defense. That's why they're a superpower, but their economy is very small. Finally, the current leader of the Soviet Union, you guys know that's Vladimir Putin, but who did he come to power after? So you read in the book, you read about Khrushchev, and you read about Gorbachev, and you read about Yeltsin. Just understand what happened before Putin, and you'll be fine. That's it for this week. Sorry the lecture's so short. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great week. Take care now. Bye bye.